I'll start reassembling the shutter by cleaning and reassembling the diaphragm components. So I've got them all sitting here. They're all fairly oily. They'll all need to be cleaned. So I'll start with the case first, I think. Move those blades. This just needs to be swabbed with naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid. This is the tin I've got. Ronsonol's probably fairly common around the place. I'll just apply some to a cotton bud, Q-tip for you Americans, and just swab all the surfaces inside and out. Be careful of that flash contact there, you don't want to bend that. You can see by the colour of that, there's a lot of dirt and lubricant coming off there. The problem with the diaphragm here was that the blades were quite oily. Almost certainly that oil had come from the focus helical and found its way into the back of the shutter and onto the shutter blades, or the diaphragm blades in this case. That's a fairly normal process. More volatile components of the grease just evaporate and then they just redeposit or settle on any convenient surface. Often that's lenses too, they can settle on lenses. You end up with an oily haze. Well, that's looking pretty good. That'll do quite nicely. I'll put that to one side. Here's the retainer plate. It's got a rivet on it that serves as a locator. It fits into a little recess in the case back and means that you can't put it in the wrong position. You can see by the colour there's a lot of stuff coming off it. One side has 5 small indentations in it. That faces to the shutter blades. The other side is completely smooth. That faces the diaphragm blades. You can probably see there's a mark about here. That's a fingerprint. That's the mark of someone when they were assembling it in a factory. The shutter would have been assembled in the Deckel factory, not the Kodak factory, because Deckel made the shutters and Kodak simply fitted them to the camera bodies in the Retina factory. Right, well that looks nice and clean. This side, it faces the diaphragm blades. Likewise, that's nice and clean. And it's lost that oily sheen it had earlier. The moving plate. This is the plate that, as it's moved from left to right, opens or closes the diaphragm blades. Likewise, this was quite oily. As you can see, I'm holding these components by the edges. If you wanted to go mad, you could wear rubber gloves or something. Or finger cots if you wanted to pretend you're a watchmaker for the day. But this is adequate for this sort of work. Alright, that'll do for that. Now we have the diaphragm blades. Now the diaphragm blades, I'll zoom you in a bit. They have a little rivet on each side, serves as a pivot point. Be careful when you're cleaning these that you don't catch the Q-tip on the edge of the blade. It's easy as you're swiping to bring the Q-tip back, catch the end of the blade and bend the blade up. That's undesirable. If you bend it, it's very hard to get them to lie dead flat again. If they've got a bit of a bend in them, it'll just make the diaphragm mechanism a little bit stiffer in action. See, I'm holding them down with the sides of the tweezers there. I don't want to poke the sharp points into the blades and scratch them. So that's nice and clean now. It's a lighter colour because it's lost the oil that was sitting on the surface. Let's do another one. These blades are in quite good condition. Occasionally you'll find blades that have slight surface corrosion on them. Often you get a tracery, like branch work on them, and it's probably the result of fungus growth or something. But these ones do not show any problems like that. You can polish blades with metal polish if you need to remove corrosion. But diaphragm blades in particular are tricky to deal with because the rivets are easy to catch on whatever you're using to polish them, and then you run the risk of bending the blades. As you can see, you go through a few cotton buds cleaning these, and that's alright, they're cheap. For your benefit here, I'm working on a green paper towel. Normally I'll just work on a white one, but if I use a white one, the camera says, oh, that's a bit bright, I better shut down the aperture, and then you can't see anything. That looks good. That doesn't leave much here to deal with except for the screws. And I usually just give these a wipe over to remove any oil that might be sitting loose on the screws. Try not to flick them away when you're doing this. That'll do. Now I can reassemble this lot. I'll start reassembly. This is the jig that I use for reassembling the diaphragm. This is a 1/2 inch square drive socket. This one is 27mm. This is a 1/2 inch square drive socket. This one is 10mm. And I've just got a piece of wood sitting loosely in between them. It just sits like that. And this allows me to reassemble the diaphragm quite easily. Deckel did have a picture of a device which did much the same job, but possibly wasn't as handy as this. Reassembling goes on this plate here, this hold down plate or cover plate. This is what we assemble things on. This is plain side up, not the side with the dimples. The rivet should be pointing upwards because it's going to fit into the case. And now we can put the blades in position. And you can start just about anywhere you like. I usually try and avoid that position there. Otherwise you can't swing the blades out easily. And basically you just lay the blades in. A little pivot towards the centre here is down, and drops into one of the holes. I'm using a toothpick here to help me get that lined up. And you just need to lay the blades one on top of the other until you get round to where there's no more room. And here we're at it. You can see that the hole in the plate is hidden. I'll pull that blade back slightly. Drop in blade number 4. Now I've got to pull this blade out so that I can see this hole to fit blade number 5. That's probably far enough. That's it. Now I'm going to lift this blade back over the top of the rivet on this one, swing it in towards the centre, swing all the blades in towards the centre. Now I can put the moving plate on there. Here's our moving plate. The rivet should be up. And the rivet here is facing towards me, 6 o'clock position. This rivet should be facing upwards at about the 7 o'clock position. We just put this on over the top of those blades, and the rivets in them should pop up into the slots. Here's the case. That little rivet there fits into a hole in the case here. So I'm just going to lower this into place. Give it a bit of a wriggle, make sure it's seated, flip it over. And I've lifted off the outside of that jig. I'll pop that underneath. I've got 3 positions there to put my screws into. Now I've done those screws up lightly, haven't tightened them right up. I need to check that everything's in position. We can take that out now. If I can check that the 5 rivets or pivots are coming up through the plate there, we turn it over, move the rivet that comes up through the slot, and you can see that those blades open and close smoothly. So that's all good. I can nip those 3 screws up tight. Don't overdo it. They're quite small screws, they're only going into fairly soft aluminium. You will strip them out if you overdo it. So that diaphragm's moving much smoother than it did previously. There's still a little bit of resistance there, and this probably means there's some friction between this ring and the case. I'll show you how I deal with that. I'm going to apply a bit of graphite powder here just to these points here where those pivots run through the slots in the settings ring, and in here where the settings ring runs against the case. I've got some loose in this container. This is just graphite powder. You usually find it at the hardware. It's intended for putting into locks and other such things. I'll just pop a little bit in there and just rotate this around to distribute that in around the edges. Move this back and forwards. That feels very good. I'll put a bit in here. And graphite powder is great for this sort of thing because it's dry. I'm going to blow out any excess shortly, so it'll just leave a very thin film on surfaces that contact each other. But that's working nice and smoothly now, so I'll just go outside with my rocket blower and blow that out, and that should be good to go. Right, well, I've blown all the excess powder out, and that now moves very smoothly indeed. There's no resistance there to speak of. It's nice and smooth. There's no loose powder. Using graphite powder to lubricate metal surfaces like that works really well, but it must be done when there's no oil or grease or anything else present that might trap the powder. Otherwise graphite powder will clump up on areas like that, and later on will just fall out and end up on the back of the lens element or some other place you don't want it. But on absolutely clean and dry areas like this, and we know they're clean because I've cleaned them, that causes no problem at all. The graphite only ends up as an extremely fine coating on surfaces that contact each other, and all the rest has just been blown away. So that is the case and the diaphragm, and so that part's dealt with, and the next thing to assemble, clean and assemble, is the mechanism plate. Well, here are the mechanism plate components we have to clean. Blades, screws that hold the lens tube in place, blade actuating ring which is held down by the lens tube, a little bracket that holds the tab on the main drive spring, and the mechanism plate itself. Here's the mechanism plate. Still on it is this spring here, the detent spring. Normally you leave that in place, but be aware it's there because while you're cleaning it you could catch the cotton bud on it and flip it off, whereupon it disappears off to the far corner of the room and you'll never see it again. So, same as before, naphtha on a cotton bud, swab all the surfaces, what we're trying to do here is get rid of any traces of old grease. The grease itself is not a particular problem if it's in the right places, but what happens is that over time grease gathers up dust, and dust and grease form a grinding paste when you get to that point. So instead of being a lubricant, it becomes a grinding paste. It'll wear stuff away. So we want rid of all of that. We want rid of any dust, any grease that's holding it in place. And of course we don't want grease, dried out sticky grease, stopping components from moving freely. You may have to do this once or twice. Sometimes you get oil down in amongst the rivets. It doesn't immediately lift out. In this central groove here, this recess, that's where the blade actuating ring sits and moves inside that area. Okay, well that looks pretty good. Pop that one to one side. Here's the blade actuating ring. Now you can probably see some silvery patches on that. Now that will almost certainly be where graphite grease has been in the past, or possibly just dried graphite. I'm removing the grease from this for the same reason as before, because the grease may have picked up dust and no longer be acting as a lubricant. And old grease tends to dry out, these volatile components disappear and settle in useful places like shutter blades, and the less volatile components are left behind, so your grease becomes a sticky wax. Okay, so that's that. Here's the lens tube. Around the bottom surface here, that's where the blade actuating ring moves. The lens just sits down inside the inside surface here, and on the top around this area, that's where the cocking ring inside the shutter moves, and the setting ring and thing sits on top of that, and the retaining ring screws to this. Just making sure this is nice and clean. That looks good to me. And that brings us to the shutter blades. You have 5 shutter blades. There's no rivets on these, they're just flat. Now I can see an oily patch on the tip of that one there. I'm interested to see if that mark goes away. In which case it was simply oil, and it has gone away. Here I'm using a toothpick to hold the blade down while I work on it, only applying fairly, well, as much force as is required to stop it running away. If you press down hard on it, you'll make a dent in it, and the blade won't be flat and won't work smoothly after that. I'm just checking the blade, flipping it over, making sure that all the surfaces are clean. And that looks good. I'll do the next blade. checking the blade, flipping it over, making sure it's clean. That looks good. On this shutter, all the blades are identical, unlike on some others where there's a different shaped blade in one or more positions. If the blades are quite oily, you'll see a colour change as you clean them. They'll go from being black and shiny to being somewhat less shiny and more of a grey or silver colour. These ones aren't particularly oily. There was just that one obvious patch on the tip of one blade, and the underside of the blade it couples to. That looks good. Anything else to clean here? Well, it's a little bracket that holds the main drive spring, so I can certainly give that a wipe. And the 3 screws that hold the blade actuating ring. I'll just make sure they're clean. Trying to make sure they don't run away like that one did. That can be assembled now. Right, I'll reassemble this mechanism plate. Now these posts here go downwards. They go down through the mechanism plate. This spring, this detent spring, we have to get the blade actuating ring underneath that and dropped into place. So it sits like that. There's a little arm on the top here, right next to that post. Now we can swing our detent spring into position. That just bears against that little pin on the blade actuating ring. Here's the lens tube. It only goes on in one position. That little bracket there on the tube, that's got the edge cut away, that goes next to that pin there. When you're putting it in place, make sure that the little pallet here is free and that these levers are not stuck underneath the blade actuating ring as they are at the moment. And I can see my spring has come unhooked there from the post, so I'll see if I can get that back where it belongs. It's reluctant. Just hold that end down with a toothpick so it doesn't get away. its spring is reluctant to sit in position. I wonder if it's a bit out of shape. It's popped off completely now. Its spring's not sitting exactly flat. I'm going to take that off and give it a little tweak, I think. Well, look at it this way, it's not sitting flat, so I'm just going to give it a twist with a pair of pliers. I'll try that. I've got the spring all in one plane more than it was previously. I don't want the tail of the spring sticking up, because if it's like that, it'll mean it'll be applying, there'd be undue friction between it and the blade actuating ring. It is reluctant to go into place, that's for sure. Right, let's see if I have any more luck. The tweezers aren't gripping it particularly well. Well, that's sitting in position. See if I can get the lens tube on there without disturbing anything. That pallet's sticking underneath it. Yeah, that's good. That's all in position. Here we have 3 screws. One of them is slightly longer than its mates, and the longer screw goes through this bracket. And that bracket goes on that post there, which is why it's got the little extra hole in it. Make sure I've got the right screw here. If you mix these up, what happens is that you'll end up with a screw that sticks out too far through the mechanism plate and may catch on a shutter blade. And where you're using a screw that's too short for a hole, it will only be partly engaged in the mechanism plate, and as a result, when you tighten it up, you are much more likely to strip the thread, just applying the normal amount of torque to tighten the screw, because it's only bearing on perhaps one thread and not two. So I've got that in place. Snug those screws down, check the action of the blade actuating ring, and that's nice and smooth, there's no undue drag, and it's got quite a positive detent in the closed and open position, as it should do. I'm going to lubricate this with a bit of graphite powder. And the graphite powder I'll drop into this groove here. Let's just get this. You can see why I have this. Some of this powder's just loose in this container because it's been used to do exactly this sort of job. I'm just dropping that into the 5 slots that the pins come up through. And then I just want to work that backwards and forwards a few times. To distribute that graphite powder on the working surfaces. Knock off the excess. Now I'll go and blow that off with the rocket blower. Now I can put the blades in place. So I'll make sure this is set in the blade's open position. Just there. With this right up against that post, that tube, and put the blades in position. And they do have a starting position, so you need to get them around the right way. So with this blade actuating ring in the blade's open position, put our first blade here. Second blade here. I'm using a toothpick here to help me position these over the pins. Shutter blades just lie one over the top of each other, unlike diaphragm blades which are interleaved. So here's our 5th blade, get that in position. There's our 5 blades, and we can put the case on the top. The case only goes on in one position. You can see a cutout here that lines up with this position here. This lever here lines up with this position here. I just want to lower that over the top and line up the screw holes. Just like that. And there are 3 tiny screws that hold this in place. I'll just run the screws down very lightly. There's always the possibility when you're putting the case over the top of the mechanism plate that you'll disturb a blade. If the blade is now sitting on top of a pin instead of neatly around the pin, there's a danger that if you tighten this up, you would damage that blade. So I do the screws up very lightly and check that the blades all swing back into the closed position smoothly, and you can see that they do. So now I can nip those 3 screws up. And that is the mechanism plate, cleaned and reassembled. The diaphragm cleaned and reassembled in the case. And that shutters can now have all the springs and controls and so forth put back in position.